chapter 11. Lord willing, we should finish it and move on to chapter 12 today. To review, Proverbs is a book about wisdom, and it gives you a lot of practical, good advice throughout it. It talks about, managing your anger, not lusting after strange women, things like that. It talks about money management, all sorts of good stuff. There's lots of practical advice. There's lots of very spiritual advice. If you were an unsaved person, you could read Proverbs and still get value to apply to your life, even if you were not saved. However, if you would notice, if you're an unsaved person, you'd be reading through this and you'd be finding all the bad stuff that happens to the wicked. And so if I were unsaved, I'd want to make sure that I wasn't a wicked person. So even Proverbs can lead you or lead people to the gospel. Proverbs, or wisdom, is composed of what I like to say, the three components. It's knowledge, understanding, and application. So you have to know things, you have to understand them, and then you have to be able to apply that knowledge properly. I also say, because the Bible mentions it, I talk about justice, judgment, and equity, which most people are going to forget, right? Because they don't know how to relate that, and it doesn't have maybe as much practical application. But I mention it not just because the Bible mentions it, but I also mention it because you will hear the word equity a lot in this day and age, because the left is always talking about equity, but their version of equity is twisted and perverted. It is wrong. So the Bible talks about equity, and that is the proper dispensation of effectively justice. So justice is right and wrong. There is a right, there is a wrong. On the left, the only wrong is that they ever see is the people that disagree with them. People that actually think that you can have an absolute truth. I mentioned that show, What is a Woman, when it talks about the transgender movement and whatnot, and one of the things that comes across, sadly, even on like the streets, because he did man on the street interviews, was people have their own realities instead of there just being a singular reality. Just like there is a singular truth, people have their own realities and they have their own truths. And it's wrong. And it's honestly something that the youth of today, and even people like me, are going to have to fight against and stand against and have some principles. I think there's probably going to be more persecution, going in the next 5, 10, 15 years if the Lord tarries, because of stuff like this. It would be nice. We are seeing some backlash now to some of this just perverted. I don't use these words lightly, right? I used to hear people at Bob Jones University use all these words, and I was like, well, man, this is a little hyperbole. But this is not hyperbole in this day and age. I wish it was. But we're seeing some resistance, and, I don't know what'll happen, but it's good to see a little bit of pushback. There's a Muslim city, their city council voted to ban any pride flags or any flags with non-governmental flags from hanging from a flagpole. Like, well, I never thought I'd agree with Muslims on something. So, anyway, it's hard to not talk about some of this stuff, because it's just, I see so much of that and how it interacts with so much of the goodness mentioned in the Bible, and then the wickedness that you're told to avoid. So, quick recap. You reap what you sow is a very good lesson to apply in your life. If you invest time into something, if you invest time into your relationship with God, it gets better. If you invest time into your relationship with your wife, it gets better. If you invest time into your relationship with your children, if you invest time into developing your job skills, they will get better. et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you invest money into things, well, if you're careful and make wise investments, it usually returns. But God, the principle, in general, there's that truth, but the truth here is that God wants you to be generous in giving instead of what the world wants, which is, looking out for number one and the selfish person. It's all about me, which in reality is, that's what they're teaching right now, right? I feel like a girl, therefore I am a girl. I don't even have to get stuff cut off. It's really bizarre. It also talks about if you have things, and it talks specifically about food. If you have food, share the food, not necessarily give it away, right? You can't, if you can, that would be the generous giving from earlier. But if you can, at the very least, sell it. You don't hoard something and let other people suffer when they need it. We're talking about legitimate needs here. In verse 27, it says, "He that diligently seeketh good procureth favor." Now, diligent just means you're steadfast, you're persistent, you just keep doing it, okay? So if you're diligent about something, if you're diligent about your work, you keep doing your work, whether or not somebody wanders in and wants to talk about a football game. Doesn't mean you can't take a break, depending on what your role is. If you're salaried exempt, maybe it doesn't matter because you just have to get your work done. If you're an hourly person, you're digging a ditch, they're paying you by the hour, and this guy's distracting you from digging the ditch because you're leaning on your shovel talking to them. That's a different situation. So it's up to you to use some common sense regarding things like that. But favor is a word I want to kind of stick on for a little bit. Favor is goodwill. Okay. Favor doesn't mean that you have an open checkbook. Okay. When we do the right thing, God looks on us with favor. He's happy with us, and that means I do that with my children. If they, Titus went out and did a whole bunch of work yesterday that I would have had to do, and I wouldn't have complained. I asked him, or Rebecca might have asked him. He didn't complain. He just went and did it. Okay? So I look upon him with favor. If he asks me for something, I might give it to him. But, if it's a good request, right? It's not like I'm just going to do whatever, right? But, so really, that's what we want. We want our boss to look upon us with favor because we're a hard worker, because we don't ask for much. I asked my boss about something on Thursday. I've kind of been dealing with something since I started at Blue Cross, and I was like, I can live with this. I was like, well, sure would be nice if I had something else. And then, so I mentioned it to him, and then he's like, oh, well, he asked me some questions, and he was like, oh, well, we could do this. And I'm like, well, that would, take care of everything I wanted. And I don't know if I'll get that. I don't know, but I probably could. But the point of the matter was, that's even greater than what I would have asked for. So, because my boss looks on me with favor. He's a really nice boss, and he's a good boss, and he has good employees. So it's fairly easy for him. But it still doesn't mean I'm that great. It just means. Well, in this day and age, it's not that hard to be looked upon with favor. You just got to do your job. So, I point out the word mischief does not mean, we use the word mischievous now, but in the Bible it means evil. Verse 28, he that trusteth in his riches shall fall. I don't remember if we talked about this. If we did, it was at the very end. So, let's turn to Luke. Luke 12. All right. So it's the parable of the rich fool. Doing okay there, Jimmy? Yeah. So the parable of the rich fool. And he spake a parable unto them, saying, quote, well, I'm adding the quote, this is Jesus now. The ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, what shall I do, because I have no room where to bestow my fruits? And he said, this will I do. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there will I bestow all my fruits and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said unto him, thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. Then whose shall those things be which thou hast provided? So is he that layeth up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God. We know our faith needs to be in God, but it's really easy to have faith in man, and it will burn you. I like to remember the arm of flesh. Arm of flesh will fail you. I could be like, oh, I don't need to worry about my job. If I lose a job, Kelly's got lots of friends. I mean, he knows Kelly Reinhardt. He's got all these businesses, or whatever. I can get a job. I could depend on man. Now, if I lost a job, God might do something like that, but it would be God doing that, not man, right? God doesn't like it. He really doesn't like it when you depend on other people or other things. As a father, it's nice to be appreciated. And as a child, you don't appreciate it really that much because, well, you didn't ask to be born. It's their job. They're supposed to do this stuff anyway. But what children don't realize, and I speak from experience since I didn't, is that our parents don't have to be nearly as nice as they are. If you had decent parents, and I know probably not everybody here did, but if you're a decent parent, which I think everybody in here is, then you've given way more to your children than you had to. And you did that because you love them and you like them, most of the time, and you want them to be happy. Right? We want our children to be happy. God wants us to be happy, but if we're depending on the wrong thing, and that's where the danger of money comes. If you have too much, it's easy to go, well, I don't have to worry about this issue or that issue because I can pay for it with money. Well, guess what? God will throw something at you that money can't cover. He'll either take all your money, so you have nothing to depend on, or he'll give you something that money can't deal with. He'll give you cancer or something. If you're depending on this, and you know that your faith is in something, maybe even sometimes if you don't know, you're not really paying that closely attention, but your relationship with God isn't where it should be, he'll bring a trial to you. Right? That's one of the things that I realized way too late in my life is the amount of trials I have are not fixed. They depend on how I act in my life. If I do stupid things, guess what? I'm going to have more trials, and they're going to be worse trials. Okay? Now, everybody's going to have some trials. But if you put your faith and trust in God from a very early age, and you continue to do that as you live your life and you raise your children in godly ways, it's not saying you won't have any children go sideways or you won't have any problems. You still will have some problems, but you'll have fewer. Okay? And then when you do have the problems, well, guess what? Because you've established this pattern of I'm with God, I am God's servant, I am God's tool to use, I am God's clay, I am God's. When you have that attitude and you've worked on this your whole life, then you're really close to God anyway, So when you do run into those trials, they're inevitable because everybody has to go through some. They're not going to be as hard because you're going to be like, something bad happens, and instead of going, oh no, woe is me, you'll be like, God, can you help? That will just be instinctive. You'll have done this muscle memory, spiritual memory. I work on stuff all the time, and I'm programming and stuff, and I can't figure something out. I'm like, I say, God, do you have any thoughts? Just like he's a programmer. And it helps me focus. I mean, it doesn't mean that he always comes down and says, oh, well, you missed a semicolon here. But it does help me keep God in the forefront of what I'm doing. And I was not always that way, and I still have more ways to go. But you stop dropping things. Anyway, so once again, to point out, shall. He that trusted in his riches shall fall. Not might, not probably, they shall fall. So be very careful in what you trust in. It's super easy to trust in your spouse. Super easy. Depend on her for everything. You're so close, you get along so well, but then you depend on her for things that it's probably not fair, and you might be putting too much on her, or vice versa. God needs to come first. And if he's not first, he's going to do something to make himself first in your life. And you're not going to like it. Verse 29, he that troubleth his own house shall inherit the wind, and the fool shall be servant to the wise of heart. So this is, an analogy. The wind is, a whirlwind is like a tornado. So the wind is basically trouble. So if you had if you had a dust devil in your house, you would have a mess afterwards. So who is he that troubleth his own house? Well, it honestly can be any of us. I trouble my own house because I'm an idiot and have a big mouth and I'm cranky. But, prohibition was largely ushered in to this country because of the excessive drinking that went on in America. We think that prohibition and it was pushed by the women. Why? Because the women were the ones that suffered from all the drinking. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was a major instigator of prohibition. Why do I bring up drinking? Because, drinking is a good example of troubling your house. Because when you drink, you are losing in your inhibitions. You can make foolish decisions. Doesn't mean every time you'll be foolish, but you'll bring trouble into your house. Also, for those of you who think the prohibition was pointless, it actually did radically cut down on the drinking in America. So I don't care, if they wanted to bring prohibition back, I don't know. Sometimes you have backlashes to things. I don't have an opinion on the value of that. But it did, I read an article recently that said a lot of bars converted to ice cream parlors. Ice cream became the go-to for people when there was the social, and that's somebody mentioned, maybe Rebecca. I wonder if that's where ice cream social came from. And I was like, that might be. I haven't looked it up, but yeah. So people actually in America drink a lot less than we used to, statistically. So it's just kind of interesting. I thought I would mention, but drunkenness, coming home drunk, spending the whole paycheck. You can trouble your own house by going out and gambling money on the ponies. Lots of different things. You can just be an idiot, like me, and cause problems. The second part of verse 29 is the fool shall be servant to the wise of heart. Now that kind of got me, because I was like, most of this time you don't discount what happens to the wicked or the fool, but you're like, okay, well, bad stuff happens to them, and I'm not them, so I'm just going to avoid that by doing the good part here. But it says the fool shall be a servant to the wise of heart. Who wants to be servant to somebody wiser? And no fool does, I can guarantee you that. Now, if you're a wise person, you want to be servant to somebody else that's wise, but a fool doesn't. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Verse 30, the fruit of the righteous is a tree of life, and he that winneth souls is wise. So here's, one of the places we get the term, winning souls. We don't save people. God does that. We sow. Occasionally we reap. I've done a whole lot more sowing than anything else. But the fruit of the righteous is a tree of life. When I read that, and it's, a tree is something that has roots, and it grows, and it produces fruit, and then it has seeds, and then guess what? That will then keep going. I've got trees in the side of my yard that I have not planted. Okay? We had some trees planted by somebody there, and they gave off some seeds, and those trees died. We cut them down, and we have these little tiny shoots. And I just kind of ignored them. I was like, well, if they grow, they grow, and when they die, I'll cut them down and I'll burn them. But they're still going. They're doing good, and I didn't plant them. It's perpetuating. So that's what we're supposed to do, right? It's not just about getting us saved. I mean, we want other people to be saved too, but I think in this verse it's even more applicable directly to us. It would be our children, that your children, if you're saved, your children should be saved. And your children's children should be saved if you did a good job with your children. And so on, and so on, and so on. Now, inevitably, there's some falling down in some places, just because that, people are people, and they're flawed, and not everybody yields to the Spirit. But in general, that should be the habit. I mean, that should be the pattern. My grandma was saved, okay? Her sons were saved. I can't speak for all the grandchildren, but most of her grandchildren at least proclaimed to be saved, okay? But just in my father's line, I believe all of his children are saved, and of my dad's grandchildren, which would be the great-grandchildren of my grandmother, most, if not all of those children are saved. So it's just that's what it should be. And finally, verse 31, behold, the righteous shall be recompensed in the earth, much more the wicked and the sinner. Sorry. So I spent some time on this because I'm taking it literally. The righteous shall be recompensed in the earth, much more the wicked and the sinner. So recompense, to look that up, right? If you are recompensed, you're repaid. It could be rewarded. Doesn't necessarily have to be, but you are paid back. So what does that mean, and when is this? So I was wondering, okay, so people are paid back. Are they paid back with good or bad? Well, it says, the righteous shall be recompensed in the earth, and then much more the wicked and the sinner. Some views on this were just negative, like this is just judgment. And maybe that's the case. But I thought it was, you can read it a couple ways, and I also focus on the fact that it says in the earth. It doesn't just say in the future. It doesn't leave that out. It says in the earth. So I took that as the literal earth. So we are repaid, recompensed on this earth by God treating us with favor, essentially. Okay, we are also, if you want to read it the other way, the more negative way, we're also, if you don't do the right things, well, guess what? You get what's coming to you that way too. And the wicked, well, obviously they're wicked. They get what's coming to them. Now, in the afterlife, when we go to be with Jesus in heaven, there's a, as Christians, we actually get crowns, right? We are actually given crowns, and there is eternal treasures we're laying up. So there are some rewards. We don't know exactly what those translate into. I can't say that honestly I've wanted crowns as a person on earth. Like, oh boy, I want a crown. But I think when I'm in heaven, I'm going to have a different view of what crowns are. I mean, so it's good. We know there's going to be something good. But in the earth, I spent some time trying to figure out this, because it's like, okay, in the earth, on the earth, does earth mean this world? Because you got to look at these things. It's like, where is this really? But it says the earth, and as far as I can tell, we're talking about, literal ground. So I'm proposing the theory, and maybe this probably isn't, somebody else has said this too, but after the rapture, we will have the judgment seat of Christ. And then, when Jesus returns, after the tribulation, he'll have the millennial kingdom. Okay? At that point, we will be on earth. So, it's entirely possible that, as Christians, that will be where we are rewarded, is on earth. Now, for the wicked, hell, also known as Sheol, is generally viewed to be in the earth. There are scriptures for that. I didn't look them up. I should have. And then, at the very end, when, at the great white throne judgment, God casts hell, death, Satan into the lake of fire. Okay, the lake of fire, roughly at the same time, the current earth is going to be destroyed. We don't know exactly what that looks like, but it's entirely possible, at least I haven't found anything contrary, that maybe that's the lake of fire. Maybe it's just a big ball of fire. I mean, big ball of fire would still be destroyed. So maybe that's, God casts all this into the lake of fire. And this is literal. We view hell as a literal place, right? Now, can we tunnel there? No, but it is supposed to be a literal place. It's just like we're going to have real bodies, and they're going to have bodies. The wicked are going to have bodies. And so if they're cast into the lake of fire, maybe that is the current earth that is destroyed. Because after all that, we have the new earth, which is New Jerusalem. These are things that all just kind of ran together, even though we've had a lot of teaching on it I've understood it at times. And I don't expect everybody here to necessarily understand this, but it seems to make sense to me. And, Kelly, Pastor, if there's problems with my logic, please, let me know afterwards. Yeah. And that's one of the things about Scripture is very little of Scripture, I think, just has one meaning. I mean, there's a lot of places where God has this applied to this time, this applied to this time, where God does, interesting things that only when you really do, proper Bible study can you find this. I think, yeah, it's important. You don't have to, agree with what I say or anything. But the reason I'm even stressing this is because I'm taking this literally. All right? That's why. I was like, well, we know righteous are going to be rewarded. And we also know there's going to be, at the judgment seat of Christ, we're going to talk about our deeds, whether it be good or evil. Okay? So we know that. And then we also know wicked, well, they're going to hell, and then hell gets cast in the lake of fire. So you don't have to take this and spend a ton of time on it if you don't want to. But I spent a lot more time on it because I wanted to say, how would we be recompensed in the earth? That's what I wanted to really try to figure out. So who knows? Maybe I'm way off here. I've got some timelines messed up. But if nothing else, I'm just trying to say, when you take the Bible literally, you don't just gloss over things. You go, yeah, whatever. I mean, that can't happen. It's just like sticking all those animals in the ark. Well, you can't do that. But, we understand the basic point or whatever, or, make excuses or explain away. Like, well, God didn't mean that, obviously. Well, it's like, well, but he said it. So when do you explain things away? God didn't mean it. And when do you take him literally? And I've read, first of all, I don't care about how the animals got in the ark. I believe God did that. Now, whether the ark was big enough to hold all the species of the animals, which I've read that it was, okay, that it was big enough to hold the species of the animals, okay, or it wasn't, guess what? He's God. He can make the ark magically bigger inside. I mean, I don't care. He did it. And if it's mathematically possible, great. If it's not mathematically possible, I don't care either, because it's not mathematically possible to part the Red Sea the way he did it. So you believe God or you don't. Well, I guess I took a lot longer than I thought I would. I always do. I would like to kind of leave on one last note, and that is kind of going back to what I originally said about Proverbs. I told my dad that I was teaching on Proverbs, and we had some interesting philosophical discussions, or theological discussions, not philosophical, arguing about stuff, and, yeah. But anyway, when we were talking about Proverbs, he said, yeah, it was a little hard to understand him, but he said that he could talk about Psalms, but he didn't ever think about teaching through Proverbs, because he's like, there's not a lot of like cohesion. There's not themes, like here's a big section. I was like, well, but there is. I mean, they're not as obvious, and maybe they're scattered throughout 31 chapters instead of all just like in one chunk, summarized very nicely, like in the New Testament, like the book of James, which is, 5 books, I think. Proverbs is 31 books about wisdom, and then it gives you a whole bunch of chunks about, how, wisdom regarding how to deal with riches and wealth, and wisdom how to deal with, sins of the flesh, and mostly just avoid the flesh. There's all these, you break it up, and it's not as obvious, and Proverbs is great because you can kind of just cherry pick verses, and those verses are going to be exactly what they say. You don't have to worry a lot about dispensation or anything, but because they're just basic common sense verses. But, I have found Proverbs to have a lot more to it than just, what meets the eye. Reading it a chapter every day for years, which many people done. I found out my dad used to do that. I wish he had encouraged us to do that as children. But I marvel at what God has in his, in his word. And it's just, I always enjoy spending time. Of course, it takes a lot of effort because it's a lot easier to not spend time and just browse whatever, the internet, or watch TV, or play a video game, or whatever, and get your dopamine hit. Well, this is far more rewarding. And if you want to know some chemistry in the brain, when you study your Bible, you get serotonin, which is much longer lasting and provides much more satisfaction than the quick little dopamine hit we get from browsing Facebook. I don't browse Facebook, but I've got things I do browse. So anyway, thank you for your attention. Hope it made some sense.